speaker tonight. Dr. Olga Tsapina has been at the Huntington since 1998 and currently serves as the Norris Foundation Curator of American History. Prior to coming to the Huntington, she was the curator of the collection of Russian 18th century printed and manuscript materials at Moscow University Library. She holds her PhD in history from the Moscow Lomonosov University, and her scholarly interests include comparative studies of religious enlightenment, the history of autographed manuscript collecting in the United States, and correspondence networks in British America. Tonight, she will be speaking to us about the creation of the Huntington's 2012 exhibit, A Just Cause, Voices of the American Civil War. So please welcome Dr. Tsapina.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Okay, can you hear me or should I take the mic?
The mic.
Use the mic.
Use the technology. Thank you for having me, and thank you for letting me blab about our collections. I do tend to go on, so if you feel like you had enough, please feel free to flee. People occasionally do. But I hope that would be of interest to you and to your society. Speaking of a piece of trivia, I just recall, we have collections of Joseph Hooker, the general. It's not technically his papers, the letters that he received in his command. And one of them, I'll never forget it. It was a letter from a French cook who offered, that was November of 1861, who offered to open a French restaurant for the officers. And the funny thing about this letter, that it's phonetically spelled. You could hear him. He knows how to cook meats and sweets. So, you know, it takes all sorts. But what I'm going to talk about today is I wanted to say, it's not about the 2012 exhibit. I shared the layout, so if you could easily see what I was going for. But it's been 12 years since past. So you actually have, what I was trying to offer you today will be a sequel, because we acquired a very important collection of telegrams, and I'm going to show a sample. But also what I was thinking about is to think about the Civil War as an election cycle. Speaking, given the current situation, it would be very timely. So what I'm going to do today is kind of mix in to expound on some pieces from our collections. Most of them are ours, with one exception that I'll specify. And I'll just take it from there. Again, feel free to, if you have any questions, you can interrupt actually, or if you want to ask them later, will be fine too. A Just Cause, from Abraham Lincoln to Ulysses S. Grant, over April 30th, 1864. And now with the brave army and a just cause, may God sustain you. That's pure Lincoln. We'll return to the cause a little bit later. But the thing is, 3 years ago, Jefferson Davis also called a just cause. So which is it? And what was this just cause? North and South, the North and the South both believed that they were fighting a just war against an enemy. Within a holy crusade, they were equally tenacious, equally brave, and fought with equal determination. And this is what gets a little dicey. So this is us, and the thing about the Huntington, and this is not a lot of people realize that, but we have our collection of civil materials is the third in the nation. We're second only to the Library of Congress and probably the Presidential Museum of Springfield. And also another thing, that we have vast collections of materials from both the Union and the Confederate side. In part, that was because, thanks to our founder, Henry E. Huntington, he was a huge Lincoln fan, and by extension, he collected the Civil War. But also in the fact that Southern California was home to Confederate and Union families, quite a few of them. For example, there is Brown Mountain in Pasadena, where the Brown brothers, the sons of John Brown, are buried. Or lived there. Actually, in the 1890s, you could rent a mule and go up there and observe the brothers in their natural habitat, as it were. They were running some kind of smelting operation, and apparently it was local attraction. They used exactly like their father. It was unbelievable. Flowing beards and everything. But there's also Brentwood, named from Joseph Brent, the only Angelina to reach the rank of Brigadier General in the Confederate Army. And of course, there was a Howells who lived in San Francisco. That would be the family of Varina Howell Davis, the wife of Jefferson Davis. And Pasadena was especially popular because it was considered a good place to recover from lung complaints. So there's a lot of people who were recovering and recuperating. So about 40% of our acquisitions comes from donations from the local families. And this is, again, this is where it gets dicey. Because our collections cover both sides, I get to read the letters from both sides. And there is one implicit bias. Most letters home were written by nice guys. Jerks tended not to write home, or they were too busy being jerks, I don't know. But you kind of get an impression, you know, that these were very nice people, that they were loving, they loved their families, on both sides, of course. And the basic human empathy takes and you're tempted to subscribe to this sentimentalism of the picture of brother against brother. And of course, from that picture, there's only one step to there are good people on both sides sort of thing. So this is, and also another important thing, predominantly they were white. Black soldiers either could not or did not have the time to write letters. So there is, it's a really difficult proposition. It's not just difficult for us, it's morally difficult. Because the belief that you're fighting for a just cause, while your adversary is fighting for a wrong cause, creates kind of a self-serving self-righteousness. On the other hand, the only way of this predicament is to acknowledge that you cannot know that you are indeed fighting on God's side. And the only people, and by the way, this is just a disclaimer, and the only person who could actually express it perfectly was, of course, Abraham Lincoln. This is from his second inaugural address. Both sides read the same Bible, prayed to the same God, and each invoked his name against each other. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God assistance in bringing their bread from the sweat of men's faces, but let us not judge, that we not be judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither have been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. That is one of the most powerful statements of this humility. Lincoln believed that he was doing the right thing, but he could not know for sure. And he was just hoping that what he was doing was right. And of course, this belief comes with enormous toll. Not only for the lives of others, but for your own soul. Because you know that your actions were, and your involvement and your belief would cost not only somebody's life, but also your own salvation. People in America were religious at the time. They did believe in salvation of one's soul. And let me just illustrate the toll. By the way, that manuscript is from the Library of Congress. It's the only manuscript that is not ours. Everything else that you see here is from our collection. So consider Colonel Elmer E. Ellsworth. I don't need to tell his story, right? You all know that he was the first official casualty of the Civil War. He was a celebrity. Before the war, he was running gyms, he was doing presentations of some kind of calisthenics and sportsmanship. He also was the one who first introduced the Zouave uniform. He was fascinated by that. So he dies on May 25th, 1861, and Lincoln writes this letter to his parents. You probably heard about the letters about to Lydia Bixby, the widow who lost 5 sons. By the way, she did not. 3 of her boys were fine, 2 of them surrendered to the Confederate Army when were paroled, so it was not exactly, you know. But the piece of oratory, it's supposed to be the best piece of oratory ever. The thing is, Lincoln did not write it, one of his secretaries did. And it was very lofty, it was very kind of Everett-like, there was a valediction and a benediction and so on and so forth. This is Lincoln's autograph. He wrote this to Phoebe and Ephraim Ellsworth, and it's a profoundly personal letter. It was not supposed to be published, and the man was a personal friend, so he talks about his loss and their loss. And this is the last line. May God give you the consolation which is beyond our earthly powers. That is heartbreaking. This is not something that you write, for publication. And also it's important because there was no letters of condolence, official letter of condolence during the Civil War. The genre would not, or the next of kin was notified usually by somebody else, a nurse, a soldier, a fellow soldier, a stranger. So that was the first letter of condolence written by the President of the United States. And let me show you another example of that toll. That is James Alvin Bell, who died at the age of 26 at a hospital in Stanton Hospital, Washington. And what you see on the right is his last words. His fiancée, Augusta, was at his deathbed, and she asked the nurse to record it. And it's really heartbreaking. This is, I just read the last part. It looks like, oh Lord, take my spirit. Yes, I know you. You Gusta, my Gusta. Yes, take my Bible and keep it. Gusta, kiss me closer. You will always love me, always, won't you, Gusta? And it goes on for about one paragraph, and you can see that he is slipping. He's been sleeping in incoherence. That was the toll. It's easy to get lost in the statistics. We talk about 750,000 casualties. But behind every number, there's a life, like this. And this one is probably more heartbreaking. Believe it or not, this is Walt Whitman. When he was in Washington, he was looking for his brother George in Washington hospitals, but he started acting as a nurse to soldiers. So it was usually errands, writing letters, and occasionally, sometimes you could see that somebody asked for butter or something sweet, so he would get it from them. But this is the entry on June 25th, 1863. Shot for desertion. I noticed elderly man weeping bitterly. Joseph Grover, poor man, wretched father. He is a butcher from Grover, from down in Pennsylvania. His son, William Grover, aged about 18 and 19, was shot at Leesburg for desertion. He was a nice man on last Friday. 3 were shot. He has been out for 2 years and a good soldier, but he was very fond of his mother. He was denied furlough. So he went to see his mother. He was apprehended and shot. So there is another heartbreak. So there was 750 heartbreaks like this. So this is why that's so important to talk about the Civil War, not necessarily just in technical terms of battles lost and won, movements of troops, but the human toll and what exactly was, what was the price? Why did they fight? Why did they die? So one of the things that you probably know this, you always see it, that the Union must be preserved. This obsession with the Union. There was some, even a kind of a conversation why Lincoln was so obsessed with the Union at the expense of slavery. It actually was more than a technical obsession. It's not about politics, it's about faith and patriotism and American exceptionalism, if you will. So this is the engraving what shows the Constitutional Convention. The Constitution was revered not because it was a charter given by God, but because it was hammered out, it was a compromise. And again, you have to understand that people in the 19th century were very biblical. There is a passage in the Gospel of Matthew 18:19, that says that if even 2 of you agree on anything, that would be done by my Father, which meant that any agreement between humans is a sign of divine grace. Humans cannot agree on their own, they always need divine intervention, which kind of makes sense, really. So the Constitution was revered because a compromise was made, obviously with divine intervention, that made Americans people of God's people, exceptional and united. And unity was essential, because if that unity breaks down, then the covenant with God is broken, and America basically doesn't exist as God's country. So one of the most popular, this is 1856 edition, very lavish. One of the most popular texts was the farewell address, George Washington. And there he goes on and on about the common and continual mischiefs of the parties. The political partisanship was the main enemy for him. The only way to overcome would be by the public opinion, and I like this. It agitates the community with its founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. Isn't that indeed something? 1799. So that is something that people believed that we need to get past political partisanship. We need to reconcile. And it worked at a certain point, but then there was 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act. On the right you see Daniel Webster, who delivered an impassioned address in 1850 on March 7th in defense of the Union against abolitionists. He thought that abolitionists were revolutionaries and radicals, and their fanaticism will break the Union. This is a rebuttal. This Daniel Webster pontificates on the virtues of the Union, while slavery is ruling over the land. I'm not sure what that cat-like thing is, but it looks very sinister. And on the right, you could see people in chains and a man pursued by dogs. So that is something that obviously could not be reconciled with the idea of the Union. 2 years later, Charles Sumner takes the floor to deliver his maiden speech. It was a long 3-hour speech. This is actually a pretty curious title, Freedom, National, Slavery, Sectional. Idea was that the freedom is a national, universal value, and slavery is just a local custom that could be abolished. So he was going on and on and on. And at a certain point, he held out a letter triumphantly. He was just waving it around. We have the letter. That is a letter written by George Washington in Philadelphia, the 28th of November. And he discusses a woman named Ona Judge, who was an enslaved young woman enslaved in his house by his wife. And she basically walked off of the house, went to New Hampshire, and lived there as a free woman. So here, Washington, this is a very interesting choice of words. Here, Washington, Sumner cited it to show that Washington was in favor of the abolition of slavery. He says that he does not object to it, but then he says that here he actually asked a federal officer to, and this is his words, ship her back to Virginia. The federal officer, Joseph Whipple, could not do so, which he explained that he met with her and she actually offered to return with a provision that he would free her children. She was not married yet. And this, as you could see, it's underlined. That compromise that she offered to you is unacceptable. You could see how mad he is. And then he goes on and on to say that freedom is he would grant a favor to an obedient slave, not to her. So freedom is basically not a right. It's a gift to be disposed or withheld by the master. So this is the father of the country we're talking about, right? So this is a very interesting idea of using reference to the founders to support the point. And by the way, Sumner's point was really thin. I mean, that idea that founders were against slavery was not really his best work. And then, of course, things get heated. And this is 1850, February 5th. That was really something was going on the floor of Congress, because what was happening, they were trying to adopt the Constitution of Kansas. So there was a lot of congressional shenanigans. Basically, what happened was that the Republicans fled, the Democrats fled, and there was no quorum, and they could not pass the Constitution. So they were trying to round them up. As they were rounding them up, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Everybody is dead tired. There are people, chewing cigarettes. There was somebody indulging in drinks. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, a delegate from South Carolina crosses over to the Republican side of the aisle and says something really nasty to a Republican from Wisconsin. At which point, somebody grabbed him by the throat. and yelled that there is no way that the slave driver is going to tell us what to do. A minute later, took a minute, there was a melee on the floor. I mean, people were fighting, there was somebody throwing a marble spittoon. There was one correspondent from an Albany newspaper. He lucked out. He was up in the gallery, so he recorded the proceedings. And he said that the Speaker of the House was pounding his desk in the mincemeat. The sergeant came with the mace of the Republic, just waving it around. Nothing was going right. At which point, a delegate from Pennsylvania grabbed a delegate from Mississippi by what he thought was his hair. It was a toupee. It came off. And he said, "Oh my God, did I scalp him?" So that is, it's a funny incident. I mean, the newspapers had a field day, but it just shows how heated the exchange was. Again, we're talking about Constitution of Kansas. And just to show that it was not a North and South thing, here's a very interesting pamphlet called Fanaticism Rebuked, Patriotic Sentiments in Large Enthusiastic Meeting. What happened was on December 2nd, 1859, a group of Southern students, and there were a lot of Southern students who studied in Philadelphia at Medical College. So they broke up a prayer group in honor of John Brown. Then there was a riot, and 5 days later, prominent Philadelphians organized a mass rally styled the Great Union Meeting. They condemned the abolitionists, they condemned John Brown, and they expressed its solidarity with the South. And 5 days later, there was an enormous crowd, estimated at 10,000, that tried to break a meeting of the Anti-Slavery Society. So it's not just the North was for against slavery and South was it. It was very complicated. It's very, very impassioned. And this is one of my most favorite pieces of our collections. Even the Library of Congress doesn't have this print, so we do. That is one of the first political rallies, mass political rallies to be staged in the state of Illinois. And this is in front of Lincoln's house. Here he is, towering in front of his, in a doorway, dressed in a white suit. It was an enormous procession. There were floats. You could see that there's a bunch of very nicely dressed young ladies. They're holding a placard about admitting Kansas to the Union as a free state. So it was a huge production. That was August in 1860. And this is what it looked like in New York. When there was a Wide Awakes, they were kind of a paramilitary Republican group. They actually do look scary. I mean, there were rumors that they were about to take over. If Lincoln loses, there were rumors that Lincoln loses, then the Wide Awakes would take over and install a military dictatorship. Again, if it sounds familiar, it's because it is. So this is one of ours from our collection of Republic of the ballots. You know that the 1860 affair was very complicated. The Democratic Party broke it free, so and people voted on tickets. So you get a newspaper, your partisan newspaper, you cut a ticket out of the newspaper, and you go to the polls and drop it in the box, and off you go. So that's Republican ticket, National Democratic John Breckinridge, and Douglas and Herschel Johnson. So November 5th, there was the election. On December 20th, Charleston, South Carolina, dissolves the Union. 2 days later, Lincoln writes this letter to Alexander Stephens, the future Vice President of the Confederacy, a fellow Whig. They were all friends. They were members of the same party. And this is a really curious letter because it's been misinterpreted a lot. He says that if the people in the first page, do the people of the South really think that if I take over, I'm paraphrasing, if I take over that I could abolish slavery? The President of the United States is not an emperor. He could not do that. He said, and then he goes that slavery in the states that it already exists in the same position as it was in George Washington. He did not have the authority to do so. But the important part is on the second page. But you think that slavery is right and ought to be supported, and we think that it's wrong and ought to be restricted. That, I suppose, is the rub. And again, this is pure Lincoln. He was fond of these arguments that pitted one opinion against another. And that is Robert E. Lee. We have his collateral collection of his letters. And this is really heartbreaking because at this point, Robert E. Lee is a federal officer. And he is writing to his cousin, Marquis. God alone can save us from our folly, selfishness, and short-sightedness. And he says that I wish to live under government, and there is no sacrifice I am not ready to make for the preservation of the Union's safe-footed honor. If disruption takes place, I shall go back in sorrow to my people and share the misery of my native state. That's also is important because you could see that the idea that American is one people is really kind of a bit of a stretch for him, his people, with the state of Virginia, not the United States. And then we go, this is something that, you know, we like to, people talk about, and scholars talk about the Confederacy as a white republic, which is correct. But it also was a white republic dedicated to the fight against abolition. I love this envelope, it's really wonderful. The sunny south of our country. Here's a baby strangling a snake called abolition under the Confederate flag. And of course, this you see a bit of propaganda all the way down in South in Dixie. Everything is fine, people enjoy the life, you know, the black people are wonderful, they're very happy, and you know. But this one, this is a unique thing. It's that is from our collection, John B. Tapscott, who served in the Corps of Engineers in the Confederate Army. Believe it or not, this is a design of the Confederate flag. The competition was announced in February 1862, so this is what he submitted. And there's a description. The colors are Republican, red, white, and blue. But that kind of looks like almost like a European Union flag. Those stars, they represent the races, black and white. They're distinct, but they're inseparable. He did not say equal, by the way, inseparable. And the motto was Jura Nostra, our rights. So interpret it as you will. And this is how not even the Southerners from Maryland imagined the South, imagined the North. This is Albert Folk, a Baltimore, Maryland dentist, he was German, so you could see that his style was very elaborate German romanticism. And it's called The Worship of the North. I just love it. There is devilish Lincoln sitting on top of something, blocks I suppose, which include not only Negro worship, but also atheism and socialism. Again, if it sounds familiar, it's because it is. People use socialism and communism as, you know, boogeyman back in the 60s. And of course, there's a statue of John Brown and the usual, and of course, they love the ego, that they're so self-centered, the people of the North. And then something interesting happens in the spring of 1861, after the war has started. A black man enters the conversation. So this is a really curious cover produced in Philadelphia, and that illustrates that famous incident when 3 men escaped enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, came to Benjamin Butler and announced that they were ready to work for him. It's actually pretty curious because I mean it imitates what's supposed to be black accent, but it's curious that they say that they are not contraband of war or merchandise. Contraband are things. This is material. So people when called former slaves contraband, they basically reduce them to things. But this envelope said volunteer sappers and miners from the first families of Virginia, or merchandise contraband of war. Obviously, the author of this caricature of the cartoon was leaning on the first option. And by the way, the federal authorities never used the word contraband. It was just colloquial shortcut. It was usually for former slaves or something else, something along these lines. And I'm really proud of this. I found it in the papers of Joseph Hooker. I was just looking through for something else and found this one. This is a list of contrabands or Negroes. in camp of, that would be Excelsior Brigade in Maryland in November of 1861. You could see that most of these men, well, you can't probably, but trust me, you can. These are young men mostly, but look at this gentleman. This is a 15-year-old who is called Abe Lincoln. I don't think it was his real name. I think it was his tribute to the president. But the document is amazing because on the other side, these are men of working age who could be employed usefully for the Union troops. But on the other side of the document, there are women and children and some older folks who apparently were kept in the camp and provided for. Again, this is Maryland. The Maryland never left the Union. The fugitive slave law was still in place. Hooker's men were supposed to turn them over to the enslavers, and to their great credit, they refused to do so with Hooker's encouragement. So this is a really curious document. That was an appendix to a report. And this is also a very interesting piece of, I would suppose, memorabilia in this case. It was collected as memorabilia inside Frederick Douglass. We are fighting the rebels with one hand when we should be striking with both unchained and block hand. This is a paraphrase of an article that Douglass published in the Atlantic in September, and he did argue for enlistment of black men. This is something that he penned. It was auctioned at a charitable auction, which also attests to the fact that Douglass was a bona fide celebrity. His autograph was worth something that could be auctioned off. In 1862, Congress updates militia bill. They basically just made one change. They struck out the word white for the qualifications. It was free men of age, who were American citizens who could be fighting. And this is Homer Winslow. This is really a curious period because in the trenches you see a black soldier who is valiantly building the breastwork and a white deserter. Very miserable looking and kind of puny. So, and this is a recruitment poster. It's very rare, but you could see, and also you could see a very curious change in the facial features. Usually in the earlier, black folks were kind of pictured as caricature characters. Now they kind of look almost like white. The facial feature is different, the mustache, the uniform, and it's only important that this is a black man who is liberating black people. And it's on the back, of course, there's a public school, not just any school, a public school. So it's all that goes hand in hand. And the black man also enters the conversation in the South. This is a wonderful letter because sometimes there was a myth of an enslaved population who did not rebel. They did rebel, just people didn't talk about this. And this is a letter from a Georgian officer to his agent, and he said that my Negroes are in a high state of insubordination. And it's basically a revolt. What he is describing is a revolt with his plantation. He doesn't know what to do. So this is something that changed the calculus, the political calculus, and the moral calculus of the war. So, but of course, there is a constitution as it is. I'm going to speed up a little bit. This is a very curious envelope. It's very rare. It's called God Watches Over Them and published in New York. And you could see the two boys fighting. And again, there's some kind of sentimentalizing of the boys, you know, the children. They don't know better, they're just fighting. So here they are, as it is, Confederate and Union fighting. And this is how it will be. They're both sleeping together in one bed covered with the Union flag. But look what's at the foot of the bed, a broken black doll. So that is something that is not worth fighting for. That is a very, and this is that's obviously a democratic production. It was produced for the sentiment that the Constitution should be preserved as it is, with slavery intact, and the Union should be as it was. This one is really rare. Nobody knows who drew this. It exists in about 10 copies. We have one, and this is Lincoln as a king, as a tyrant. With his cabinet, especially like the toad thing that sits at the bottom. Apparently, it was obviously something sinister. Mostly because Lincoln was perceived not only as a tyrant, but also a black Republican and even Jacobin. And his policies were deemed tyrannical and royal-like. And of course, one of the things that Lincoln did was to install their IRS. And this is one of the best pieces of Civil War humor ever. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's available for free on Kindle or Amazon. It's called Orpheus Seeker's Letters. Office Seeker is a play on words, Office Seeker. And it's a adventures of the unfortunate Mackerel Brigade. They always go on adventures and always ends ridiculously. My favorite is, there was a wonderful chapter that describes how they went on in the field and they shed some blood and the banner was, avenged. It turned out that they killed the chicken at the end. So this is a really wonderful musing on the patriotism and taxes. Patriotism, my boy, is a very beautiful thing. The surgeon of a Western regiment has analyzed it, a very nice case of it, and says it's peculiar to this hemisphere. He says it first breaks out in the mouth, and from thence extends to the heart, causing the letter to swell. He says it goes on raging until it reaches the pocket, when it suddenly disappears, leaving the patient very constitutional and conservative. If a genuine American ever dies of patriotism, it will be because the tax bill hasn't been applied soon enough. So that was, there was also grumblings about the IRS. And of course, there was the Emancipation Proclamation. This is an extremely rare copy. There are only 11 of these in the extant. These are the pocket editions, it's about this big. And this is what the Union officers would hand over to the plantation owners, informing them that his people are now free. The thing about the Emancipation Proclamation, there are a lot of misconceptions about that because sometimes it's described as an executive order. It was not. It was a proclamation. A proclamation is basically a public announcement. Something happens, the president makes a proclamation. Proclamation of Thanksgiving, a proclamation of whatever. And in July of 1862, the Congress passed the Confiscation Act. It's a long story. I'm not going to bore you with it. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer. That's my own theory, by the way. I kind of speculated on this. But there were two parts: the confiscation of property and emancipation of the slaves. So basically, what Congress did, he added death penalty as punishment for treason. It used to be just a confiscation of property. Lincoln did not sign the Emancipation until he had anything that looked like a victory, which was Antietam, and then he signed it. And there's a wonderful, what they call the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was not a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It just gave the rebels 100 days grace period to come back to the Union. If they would return the emancipation, they would be spared of this. So in the intervening 8 months, you know how it is. Maybe he'll revoke it. Maybe something happens. Maybe there will be no Emancipation Proclamation. Will he or won't he? And on January 1st, I just love this story. He went to the Oval Office. To his office. He just had pressed a lot of flesh. There was a New York reception at the house. So his hands were a little shaking, and he massaged them for about 10 minutes just to steady them. Then took the pen, signed Abraham Lincoln, not A. Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, put the pen down, looked at the people around him, said, "Here, that'll do." This is pure Lincoln. But the Emancipation Proclamation also, of course, was vilified in the North and the South. This is our friend Adalbert Folk. Lincoln is writing the Emancipation Proclamation. There's a lot of stuff going on here, including some bottle of liquor on the background, and of course the portrait of John Brown, and some devilish things, and the toad, and I'm not sure what that thing in the corner is, but it really looks scary. This is, again, Albert Folk. This is what the Southern, a lot of Northern people imagine an emancipation would look like. I don't want to make connections, but this is his portrayal of Haitian people. That's Haitians after the emancipation. I don't see them eating dogs and cats, but close enough. And this is, it's a pure fantasy. I mean, it's a leftover from the trauma of the 1791 revolution, but this is what people actually thought would happen if black people would get freedom. And by way of contrast, this is what actually happened in New York in the draft riots. This is a very interesting image because you could see that it's, at this point, a black man, a grandfather who is trying to protect his granddaughter, is assaulted by others. This is the moment when a black man becomes one of us. He is assaulted by the foreigners, the Irishmen. So it's how to escape the draft. It's in Harper's Ferry. And here, may I introduce my old-time favorite Civil War soldiers. You probably never heard of him. It's John Bird. By the way, his descendants still in the area. There's a Bird production company. His great-grandson was Billy Bird, a child star. He died in, I think, early 90s. But John Bird was there was a lot of things that were amazing about this collection. For one thing, he loved his wife of 15 years, and he had a need to write to her. And it was not just formal letters, you know, with arrangements in camp, we're bored, and so on and so forth. It was almost like stream of consciousness. He wrote everything he saw. And this is what he wrote to her on January 10th, 1863. I thought I hated slavery before I came down here, but it has increased 100-fold. It's one of the most damnable, man-degrading, soul-killing, God-dishonoring institution that ever was permitted to exist in the face of the earth. And I think I can see its death struggles and its death groans, and oh, how I rejoice to see its wreathen agony. That is a letter to the wife. It's not an editorial. And Bird was really an amazing man. And just to give you just one example that's completely irrelevant, but he missed his wife terribly. And he describes in one letter that he was sitting at the campfire, and his lieutenant comes to him with a cup of tea. And he said, "You know, Captain, if you put the cup of tea to your face, it feels like a woman's cheek." And he just broke down. He missed his wife and his children so much. Also, one of the best letters, beginning of the letters ever, that he writing it from Georgia. He said that this morning, I woke at 2 o'clock in the morning because a large frog was sitting on my face. And when he jumped, he shoved me. So this is one of the best examples of the sentiment. So when we talk about the Union soldiers, not a lot of them felt that way. Bird's case was in a way exceptional, but it's a really nice piece of sentiment 10 days after the Emancipation Proclamation. And this is a famous letter that I cited. That's April 30th, 1864. That's Lincoln to Grant. That, by the way, it's a donation from the local donor. And this is a very lawyerly and kind of oblique letter. He's very anxious to avoid a great number of casualties, but he trusts Grant to do what he needs to be done. And then he concludes, "And now with a brave army and a just cause, may God sustain you." The chronology is important. April 30th. On April 8th, the Senate passed a resolution to amend the Constitution to abolish slavery. That's a just cause he's talking about. Of course, that would be the bloodiest campaign of the Civil War. That's the Virginia 1864 campaign. And then we go to the political election season. This is a wonderful quote. That's Henry Raymond, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune. We have his papers. We have a lot of things. And a political campaign is before us of more terrible moment than any military campaign. One of the latter might fail and be retrieved by another. But if this campaign fails, it's irretrievable. There will be no subsequent opportunity to undo its effects. It would settle the war decisively, fatally, forever. Again, kind of reminds you of rhetoric these days. So what was this is a anti-Lincoln pro-McClellan campaign, and the idea was that the most important thing is to restore the nation's unity. With slavery, with the Constitution intact, whatever, just stop the war. And this is what I'm talking about. The war is evil, but sometimes it's really hard to argue that the war is universally evil. So this is, Lincoln basically is compared to Jefferson Davis. I love this one. This is a sermon that the Reverend Elliott in Georgia, he's hoping for Lincoln re-election. We need his fall and his fanaticism. If Lincoln wins, the North would collapse and everything will, how he concludes, everything will work out well for us. And this is a kind of an interesting moment, the birth of the word, miscegenation. That was a hoax. The kind of a yellowish pamphlet. It was actually it was written as opposed to the platform of the Republican Party. And by the way, the Republican Party rebranded itself into the Union Party. So the idea was that everybody would be obliged to marry a black woman. I mean, that's obviously ridiculous. But it was a hoax. But for some reason, a couple of congressmen, including Samuel Sunset Cox, he was called Sunset because he wrote an awful poem about sunset. It was horrible. And he actually delivered a speech that it's an outrage, you know, you can't do this. And this is a type of propaganda that was common during the election. It's a miscegenation ball, I mean, a horror, you know, black men and women dancing together. So this is something that people were, that the Democrats were trying to scare the voters. And this one is Lincoln as a heartless tyrant who doesn't care about the number of casualties. Columbia demands his children. And he said, oh, it reminds me of a little story. And of course, but then something really brilliant happened. It was the idea of Montgomery Blair and Francis Lieber. They decided to rebrand the Republican Party, drop the Republican because the Republican was associated with emancipation, and become a Union Party. And that actually worked. So that is one of the Union posters: Union, Liberty, and Union and Slavery. You notice that Lincoln is speaking to a white sailor, obviously, or a white man. But the children who are running out of school, it looks like it's black and white children. Of course, on the right, there is McClellan, who is shaking hands with Davis, and there's a slave auction. So this is the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, it looks very nice. It's signed by Lincoln, but let me tell you why it's interesting. It was published in 1864 to be auctioned off at the Sanitary Fair. In the year before, they auctioned a copy, Lincoln signed copy, and it sold on hotcakes. So they decided they hoped to repeat the feat. It did not sell at all. In the summer of 1864, the Emancipation Proclamation was very unpopular. The copies of these things are still floating around in the auctions, or even on eBay. They printed, I think about 1/3 was sold. And then there is this is a very boring looking document. This is a party platform. But look at this. Resolved that as slavery was the cause and now constitutes the strength of the rebellion, it must be always and never be hostile to principle of the Republican document, and so on and so forth. The Republican Party actually included the destruction of slavery in its platform, as unpopular as the cause was. And the government owes to all men employed in its armies, without regard to distinction of color, the full protection of the laws of war. That was another controversial issue. And you have to admire this, you know, because sometimes it's a really kind of difficult proposition. If you know that you're doing the right thing, sometimes you have to go against your constituents, or even against the will of the people, as you understand it. And also resolve that foreign immigration, which in the past has cited so much to their well-developed resources, I did on purpose, sorry, should be fostered and encouraged by all liberal and just policy applause. So that is, again, this is Thomas Nast, his idea what would a compromise with the South look like. Again, there is, on the forefront, you see a white woman crying over memory of the useless war. But on the back, you would see a black soldier being dragged back into slavery. And, well, I love this image. This is another one. This is Frank Leslie. Leslie was very conservative. They did not go for racial sentiment. But this is something that the special artists recorded when a black soldier captured the guns and cannon and the cheers of the Ohio troops. That thing were reported, that the white soldiers were skeptical in the beginning, but they were beginning more and more accepting of the black man in their ranks. And that, again, a very boring looking document, which is incredibly important. This is August. Lincoln sits with for an interview with a journalist. And he specifically asked, are you going to invoke the Emancipation Proclamation? And this is what he responds. There have been men who have proposed to me to return to slavery the black warriors of Port Hudson and policy, to their masters to conciliate the South. I should be damned in time and eternity for so doing. He knew what he was risking. This is something called the Blind Memorandum. It's August of 1864, and its signature is his, but the copy was made by Gideon Wells, the Secretary of the Navy. We have his papers. We have a lot of things. And he said that it seems that the administration will not be re-elected. And again, it's a very oblique language that he pledges to work with the president-elect to preserve the Union on the grounds it could be preserved. Then he folded it, Lincoln did, folded it in, so the cabinet could not see what's in there. And they had them all sign it. So that's Seward down to Senator Wells. So in August 23rd, 1864, he was sure that he was going to lose. And here is the sequel that I promised. In 2012, we acquired the collection of Thomas T. Eckert, the head of the United States Military Telegraph. USMT was not a corps. It was a private company affiliate of Western Union, contracted by the government of the United States. Eckert is the fellow who sits on the folding chair in the boater. That's him, and that's his. And you could see that all the operators were civilians, they were employees. At the end of his service, Eckert simply put everything in a footlocker and took it with him. Before the Freedom of Information Act, it was not non-mandatory to file, to archive everything in the federal archives. Plus, it was a private company, so he could do whatever he wanted. So now we have it. If you go to our catalog, you would see that that's a cataloging record, but more importantly, it's been digitized, uploaded to our digital library, and transcribed. We had our valiant volunteers who did for 2 years, toiled on transcribing. So that's how the digital component looks like. So you could just click on it and browse. And transcribing was no mean feat. This is what it looks like. And this is very important because these are Eckert's own letterpress books. If you ever seen a letterpress book, it's a very thin tissue paper. Because the technology was when you write a letter, you moisten a piece of cloth, put it on a tissue paper, write it. You say send out the top copy, but what remains on the tissue paper is a copy. But it's very porous, the paper is crappy, so it bleeds a lot. So it looks like basically a completely undecipherable text. Our volunteers deciphered it. And this is what was going on in October 11 of 1864. There were 3 states that called October states because the state elections, it's Pennsylvania, Iowa, and I'm blanking out on the third one, but they'll come back to me. In the October states, they were, before the general elections, they were electing local legislature, the governor, and so on and so forth. And usually what was going on in the October states was a bellwether of what was going on in the general election. So basically it's a poll. It's, as we now obsessively looking at polls, this is how people looked at the October states. So here is Thomas T. Eckert sitting in Washington, receiving telegrams from New York, mostly from Pennsylvania. Here is one of his colleagues, the indications that in Philadelphia probably would go to the Union. Next speculation that the Copperheads, or losing Copperheads, would be Democrats. Then again, another telegram, and they're reporting word by word. And again, it all, as you always know, comes down to Philadelphia, to Pennsylvania. He noticed that the Ohio soldiers were voting. This is from New York. The one that said that the Democrats lost, actually didn't. They didn't win the House at the time. So it's literally every half an hour they receive telegram with the news about the elections. That's now they realize that the state has gone Democratic on home vote, but they're still waiting for the soldiers to vote. And this one is wonderful. That's actually from New York. And it said the trouble on this wire is caused by a McClellan flag on D Street near 9th. It was blocking the wire. I have spoken to the party having charged to move it near opposite side, but they refused. So there was a McClellan flag flying around and they can't transmit telegrams. And this is, amazingly enough, this piece did not come with the USMT collection. It is written on the stationery of United States Military Telegraph. It's very faint because it's in pencil. And this is Lincoln and Eckert are sitting together in telegraph office on October 13th, trying to figure out how the vote will go on the basis of what they received, the intelligence they received. You probably can't see it, but Lincoln, the right column, yeah, it's not the best. Anyway, but one column that's Copperhead vote, and that would be the left one, and the right is the Union vote. If you could see, you could see that Lincoln expected to lose his home state of Illinois. He was also expected to lose New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. He did expect to win New England, some western states. So basically the final tally came 114 to 117 electoral votes. And then somebody reminded him that Nevada was now a state. So it's 114 to 120. Very, very close, incredibly close. And then the election day came. The soldiers did vote in the elections. This is what an election day looked like in New York. And again, Eckert received dispatches. So that was wonderful. That was somebody from New York that I gave them an hour and a half of my valuable time before I could get my vote. So there was about 200 votes at the beginning of the voting day. And slight disturbance in Cleveland, but Lincoln will have no less than 1,000 votes than Morton majority in the city. And now in the evening, are you waiting for more news or you had enough to retire upon? It is possible that New Jersey had voted for Lincoln. It did not. It voted for McClellan. But this is a bookmark. 2 days after the great and good election of '64, it's signed Francis Lieber, out of the Lieber Code. It's SC to Charles Sumner, and it says, behold, for Mac, one full-grown pair of states, and also Delaware. McClellan won 3 states, exactly. New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware. Lincoln won in a landslide. So this is really a fantastic story because you could tell, and we kind of take the result of the election of 1864 for granted, but this is what was at stake. And this is the picture of the second inaugural address. Apparently, John Wilkes Booth was in the crowd at the time. But when people quote the second inaugural, they tend to go, malice towards none and bite nation's wound. But this is, I think, is an important part. With firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive and finish the work we're in. And at this point, I am done. Oh, these are just some resources, so feel free to visit us virtually or three-dimensionally. And especially Huntington Digital Library, I highly recommend it. It's a work in progress, it's not finished, so watch the space. But it's a very useful resource. If you have any questions, I'll be delighted to go on and on.
3 tickets that you cut out of the newspaper.
Oh, sure. Sorry if you're getting dizzy.
I think that's
So that is, and you were voted on the straight ticket. You couldn't vote for a Republican or a Democrat. You just got, so everything, so for example, in this case, this is the governor, John Andrew, and the lieutenant governor and all the legislature. It's all the straight Republican ticket. We have a nice collection of ballots, beginning from the late 1850s all the way to the 1900s. Yes?
Do you mind telling us how a nice girl like you left Moscow?
Oh, I have to. Well, basically by accident. My husband got a job here at JPL, so off I went. I'm not really that much enamored of my home country these days, so. I have to apologize for Mr. Putin. I don't know why, but I feel compelled that I have to apologize. I didn't vote for him ever. I suspect somebody else did, but. Speaking of, when people complain about rigged elections, you don't know what a rigged election is. I do. Yes.
The biographical information for this talk said that you're an expert in correspondence networks in British America. What are those?
Oh, this is colonial America. I don't like to call it colonial because, well, it's a complicated issue. But the British America is basically when Americans thought of themselves as Britons. And the correspondence networks, I was very intrigued how people exchange letters and news. There were several inbuilt, obviously the newspapers, but there were also oral networks. People were just walking around and delivering news. But what I'm particularly intrigued is the ministers, especially servant writers, because they were getting around and spreading the news. It became kind of a technical issue because I was trying to figure out how long it would take for the news from the Battle of Fort William Henry in 1757 to reach different parts of the British America. And that kind of ballooned from there. Yes?
Could you put the list of resources up again?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
I could actually forward you the PowerPoint. You could upload it. It's big, so I'll have to upload it some. Oh, sorry about this.
Yeah.
Decoding the Civil War is a wonderful project. We ran it for about 4 years in partnership with Zooniverse. There's also a blog, which still is, but we finished the project in 2016, but the blog still lives, and the volunteers were absolutely fantastic. And the digital library, again, is a work in progress. So we don't have anything resembling a systematic program of digitization because it's expensive. But we do submit proposals, and it's getting populated. Yes, Chairman.
How did the Huntington acquire the telegram collection?
Oh, let me tell you a story. Well, it's really kind of funny in a way. Mr. Eckert retired from the Army in 1869. He went, he took all his stuff with him and lived in Washington and New York. And apparently towards the end of his life, there was a bit of an unpleasantness. He had 2 sons. One is a good son and a bad son. And when he wrote his will, he bequeathed everything to the bad son. At which point the good son became very offended and filed a suit. And they were trying to prove that Mr. Eckert was actually a very important kind of capitalist in a way. He was a partner with Jay Gould for a long time, and he was a very wealthy man. So one of the exhibits in the lawsuit was, believe it or not, a cat called Mr. Bubbles. Mr. Bubbles apparently was allowed on the table. He had his own place at the dinner table. There was a greenhouse with a supply of catnip. And that was to prove that Mr. Eckert was a little gaga, you know. To me, it's a perfectly reasonable behavior. I mean, every cat owner would know that. But the will was disputed, and then again disputed, again settled by the Superior Court in Pennsylvania. At which point, part of the sons were mostly fighting about the property. So they kind of forgot about the footlocker. So the footlocker was sitting by the looks of it, in the attic. It reeked of mothballs. When it arrived, it was absolutely awful. So the family discovered it in 2008 and consigned it to Bonham's auction. But it was 2008, the libraries did not have any money. The auction was not particularly successful. And the collection changed hands a couple of times, at which point Seth Keller, he's one Plains, he's a very well-known dealer. It sounds awful, but I do have a couple of dealers, so they supply me. We actually met him at a conference, so we were talking. So I have this collection, and just send me, the description. It was a very expensive purchase, but it was done with the help of our Collectors Council. The Huntington has a Libraries Collectors Council, which helps us acquire stuff that we can't otherwise afford. And during the acquisition, we had also cleared with the National Archives, because if it's USMT, technically they could claim that the right of replevin, the federal government could claim ownership. But because USMT was a private company, it was clear for us to acquire. And this is an amazing collection, because there are a lot of things about amazing. This is just a small part what I showed you. On top of everything else, the telegrams were coded. And in a way, the encryption is absolutely fascinating, because they use something called the word substitution code. It's not a letter substitution code. It's every word was substituted for another word. It was completely arbitrary. So every operator had a list of a set of code books that was specific to this pair. Even if the telegram was intercepted at the word, you can't make out what's going on. It's gibberish. And we still can't decipher some telegrams that we don't have the code books for. So feel free to browse. We also have, by the way, in the digital library, we also have the manuscript of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. If you want to read it, it is on the out.
Do you have to be a member of Huntington in order to access this?
Oh no, it's free for everybody. If you go, again, normally I would say go to our website, but I won't, because it's been refurbished. Just Google it. Telegraph collection of Huntington usually gets, that's the first hit. The catalog, the digital library, but you could also download from there. Again, it's free. The Huntington, we have abide by the Freeman's Doctrine, which means that we only own physical objects, we don't own intellectual content. So if you want to use it in a presentation or anything you want, it's yours.